There's a place at the southern tip of Brooklyn where the Atlantic Ocean meets a boardwalk that's seen better days, where the smell of salt air mixes with funnel cake and something that might be regret. Once, this was the most famous amusement destination on the planet. Millions of people packed onto its shores every summer. Entire generations grew up here, and then, slowly, and then all at once, it fell apart. This is Inside the Decline of Coney Island, New York's Forgotten Playground. Part 8, The World's Playground. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what Coney Island actually was, and how extraordinary that was for its time. By the mid-1800s, Coney Island had already begun attracting visitors to its beaches. But the version of Coney Island that would stamp itself on American memory didn't arrive until the turn of the 20th century, when 3 amusement parks opened in rapid succession and changed everything. First came Steeplechase Park in 1897, founded by a Coney Island native named George C. Tillieu. His philosophy was simple: make people laugh and they will come back. And they did. Steeplechase offered mechanical horse races along a track, hence the name, plus a carousel, a massive ballroom, and a general atmosphere of good-natured chaos. Tillieu had a way of making people feel like they were getting away with something just by being there. Then came Luna Park in 1903, built by Frederick Thompson and Skip Dundee. If Steeplechase was the family-friendly option, Luna Park was pure spectacle. The park was lit by over 1 million electric lights, earning it the nickname, the Electric City by the Sea. And it was so dazzling that hundreds of imitators sprang up across the country almost immediately. Walt Disney visited Luna Park regularly when he came to New York, and by most accounts, it served as significant inspiration for what would eventually become Disneyland. Dreamland followed in 1904, built by a politically connected developer named William Reynolds, who essentially watched Luna Park's success and decided he wanted in. It was bigger, more elaborate, and had its own pier so guests could arrive by steamship. It was also short-lived. In 1911, a fire that started in a ride called Hellgate burned Dreamland to the ground. The lions in the menagerie escaped. Some were shot in the streets. It was a dramatic end, even by Coney Island standards. By 1910, Coney Island was arguably the most famous resort in the world. Holiday crowds had climbed from around 100,000 on a busy day in 1900 to over 1 million visitors in the 1920s, thanks largely to the subway system's expansion. When the rail lines to Coney Island were integrated into the New York City subway in 1920, the fare was just a nickel. That single change opened the doors to an entirely new class of visitor: the working poor, recent immigrants, anyone who needed an escape from the tenements of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. Coney Island became known as the Nickel Empire, and it earned the name. In 1923, a public boardwalk was built, and the beach was formally open to everyone. The 1920s saw the construction of the Wonder Wheel, 5 new roller coasters, and in 1927, the Cyclone, which still stands today and is still considered one of the great wooden roller coasters in the world. George Tillieu himself once said, "If Paris is France, then Coney Island, between June and September, is the world." He wasn't exaggerating by much. Summer crowds in the 1940s topped 2 million on peak days. 2 million people on a beach in Brooklyn. The logistics alone are staggering to think about. The sheer variety of what was on offer is hard to communicate now, because nothing quite like it exists anymore. You had mechanical wonders that people from rural areas and immigrant communities had never seen anything like. You had freak shows, which carry their own complicated legacy, but also high-wire acts, trained animal performances, and theatrical reenactments of historical disasters staged with actual pyrotechnics. Luna Park offered a ride called A Trip to the Moon that simulated space travel years before anyone had the faintest idea what space travel might actually look like. There were scale models of world landmarks. There were baby incubators, actual premature infants in working incubators, tended by nurses. Displayed as a kind of scientific marvel by any modern standard, a lot of it was exploitative, but the scale of human imagination being applied to public entertainment was genuinely staggering. Coney Island was where American popular culture went to try things out. If it worked at Coney Island, it traveled. The amusement park industry that eventually gave the country Disneyland and Six Flags and Cedar Point, all of it traces its lineage back to those 3 parks on the southern tip of Brooklyn. Part 7. The first cracks. The peak didn't hold. It rarely does. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit Coney Island hard, but in a strange way, the place survived it better than most. The whole point of the nickel empire was that it was affordable. When millions of people were broke and miserable, Coney Island offered a few hours of distraction for almost nothing. Crowds still came, but the Depression took its toll on the infrastructure itself. Luna Park, which had been struggling even in the 1920s to keep its attractions fresh and rotating, was operating on fumes by the late 1930s. The live reenactments that had once drawn enormous crowds, dramatizations of the San Francisco earthquake, Civil War battles, the sinking of the Galveston flood, had grown stale. The public had moved on, and the park couldn't keep up. Then, in August 1944, Luna Park burned. A fire tore through the western half of the park, causing roughly $800,000 in damage and destroying several major attractions. The park limped along for 2 more years before shutting permanently in 1946. The land sat empty, and a city official with very specific ideas about what Coney Island should look like was already circling it. His name was Robert Moses, and his fingerprints are on some of the most consequential and most destructive urban decisions in New York City history. Part 6. Robert Moses and the Slow Demolition. Robert Moses is one of those figures in American history who managed to be both enormously productive and enormously damaging at the same time. As New York City's Parks Commissioner and later its Coordinator of Construction, a role he shaped into one of the most powerful positions in city government, he reshaped New York for decades. The question was always, what was he tearing down to do it? Moses despised Coney Island. He looked down on what he called the riff-raff establishments, the arcades, the freak shows, the general carnival atmosphere. He preferred the clean, managed environment of Jones Beach, the Long Island State Park he had built and controlled. Coney Island, with its noise and its crowds and its working-class energy, offended him. He had published a report as early as 1937 outlining possible redevelopment of the area. After World War II, he began acting on it. In 1937, Moses had taken over jurisdiction of Coney Island's beach and boardwalk through the Parks Department. From that position, he started methodically removing the infrastructure that made Coney Island function. He wanted bigger parking lots to accommodate automobiles, a choice that was not incidental. Moses consistently prioritized car access over public transit, and in a neighborhood that was built around the subway, that preference was a quiet kind of sabotage. More parking meant fewer amusements. Fewer amusements meant fewer visitors. Fewer visitors meant lower property values. Lower property values meant it became easier to justify the redevelopment he'd had in mind from the beginning. When fires damaged sections of the boardwalk in 1939, Moses moved quickly to demolish the damaged structures rather than repair them. On January 22, 1940, bulldozers moved in. The pace of removal accelerated through the 1940s. When Luna Park's land became available in 1949, Moses moved quickly. He asked the city to transfer the waterfront property to the Parks Department. The request was granted. He then had the land rezoned for residential use. He moved the boardwalk back from the beach, demolishing the city's municipal bathhouse and several blocks of amusement concessions in the process. He argued, with data that many considered selective at best, that Coney Island's visitors were declining because people preferred open-air beaches like Jones Beach to the mechanical gadget attractions of Coney Island. What he didn't mention was that his own policies were actively removing the things that made Coney Island appealing in the first place. In 1949, Moses declared the residential west end of Coney Island an urban renewal zone and used eminent domain to level the entire neighborhood. What had been a functioning, if modest, working-class community was replaced with high-rise housing projects, surrounded for years by vacant lots and rubble. In 1954, the New York City Planning Commission, heavily influenced by Moses, unveiled a master plan for Coney Island that would have demolished nearly every building within a 60-block radius. Only a narrow amusement zone between West 22nd and West 8th Streets, extending just 200 to 400 feet from the shoreline, would survive. Everything else would be converted to residential development. There was public outcry. Some elements of the plan were walked back, but the damage was done in mindset, in zoning, and in the slow disinvestment that followed. By 1990, storefronts on Mermaid Avenue, once a vibrant commercial strip, had decreased by roughly 90% from their pre-urban renewal numbers. That's not a rounding error. That's a neighborhood that was essentially erased. Charles Denson, director of the Coney Island History Project, put it plainly. Moses's battle plan was to attack Coney Island from its western flank and work his way east. Part 5. The Steeplechase debacle. If Moses set the fire, what happened to Steeplechase Park in 1966 poured gasoline on it. Steeplechase was the last of the original 3 great Coney Island amusement parks. It had survived the fire that destroyed it in 1907. Till you rebuilt it almost immediately, had survived the Depression, had survived the war years. It operated from 1897 until the end of the 1964 season. 67 years, longer than any other park in Coney Island's history. On September 20th, 1964, at 7:35 in the evening, the lights went out in the Pavilion of Fun for the last time. Former employees, Tillu family members, and longtime associates gathered for a closing ceremony. They played Auld Lang Syne. It was a genuinely sad night. No official announcement of permanent closure had been made, but rumors about a sale started circulating almost immediately. What happened next is the kind of story that could only unfold at a place with Coney Island's particular history of wheeling, dealing, and opportunism. Without the agreement of her siblings, she sold the entire Steeplechase property to a developer named Fred Trump, yes, Donald Trump's father, in July 1965 for $2.5 million. She turned down bids from local operators, including the owners of Nathan's Famous, in favor of the more lucrative Trump deal. The assumption in the community was that the park would continue to operate until Trump obtained the necessary zoning approvals for residential construction. That assumption was wrong. Trump never opened the park for the 1965 season, and in September 1966, faced with a growing effort to get the Steeplechase Pavilion designated as a historic landmark. This was the era right after the demolition of Pennsylvania Station had finally awakened New Yorkers to the cost of losing their architectural heritage. Trump acted. He threw a demolition party. Guests were handed bricks and invited to hurl them through the stained glass windows of the Pavilion of Fun, specifically through the famous funny face, the grinning Steeplechase mascot that had become a symbol of the whole neighborhood. Then he bulldozed it. The irony is almost too thick to process. Trump never got the zoning variances he needed. The high-rise residential development he'd had in mind never materialized. He eventually sold the site to the city for $4 million. The land sat largely vacant for decades. It wasn't until 2001 that anything was built there. A minor league baseball stadium for the Brooklyn Cyclones. The 262-foot tower that had originally been built for the 1939 World's Fair and brought to Steeplechase afterward. He hired a contractor to take it down, but the bid of $10,000 was, apparently, too high. The parachute jump was designated a New York City landmark in 1977. It's still standing today, repainted and lit up at night, though it hasn't operated since 1964. When Steeplechase closed and failed to open for the 1965 season, Charles Denson later wrote, "The resulting publicity created a worldwide impression that the whole of Coney Island had closed. That impression stuck, and it wasn't entirely inaccurate." Part 4. The Long Slide. Crime, neglect, and the 1970s. What followed the loss of the parks was a decade and a half of genuine urban crisis. The housing projects that Moses had built to replace the amusements and working-class neighborhoods filled quickly, and without any corresponding investment in services, infrastructure, or economic opportunity, they deteriorated fast. Arson became a serious problem. There were periods in the late 1960s and 1970s when entire blocks would burn and no one moved to rebuild. Street crime increased sharply. The beach and boardwalk, which had once been civic jewels, became neglected and dangerous in stretches. The subway ride to Coney Island, which had once been a symbol of democratic access, became something many people now thought twice about. The 1964 season had already been dismal. Concessionaires reported that they'd had 30 to 90% fewer visitors compared to the previous year, in part because the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows was pulling visitors away. By 1967, Mayor John Lindsay declared the west end of Coney Island a poverty zone. In 1964, a mob of roughly 4,000 young people, many of them teenagers from nearby housing projects, rampaged through the amusement area on Memorial Day weekend, forcing businesses to close early. It was widely covered in the press, and it accelerated the perception, fair or not, that Coney Island had become unsafe. Through the 1970s, various revival schemes were proposed and abandoned. Public housing, a new theme park, luxury hotels. None of it happened. By 1975, the city was actually considering demolishing the Cyclone roller coaster, built in 1927, still operating, still drawing visitors, in favor of expanding the adjacent New York Aquarium. That proposal was ultimately rejected, and the Cyclone was landmarked in 1988. But the fact that anyone was seriously floating the idea tells you a lot about the general atmosphere of the era. The 1980s brought a drug epidemic that hit the housing developments Moses had created particularly hard. What had been the most famous pleasure ground in the world now had neighborhoods with median incomes that were among the lowest in New York City. The famous structures that remained from Coney Island's glory days became symbols of something closer to abandonment than heritage. That 262-foot tower stood rusting and inoperative on the boardwalk for decades, neither demolished nor restored. The Cyclone rattled on, but the blocks surrounding it were a long way from the vibrant commercial strip they had been. The wonder wheel turned. That was about the most anyone could say. Part 3. The revival attempts and what actually worked. The 1980s and early 1990s generated a lot of talk about revival. A new theme park, casino gambling, luxury resort hotels with the kind of Las Vegas energy that was being deployed to revive Atlantic City. Almost none of it actually happened. Plans were unveiled, renderings were published, press conferences were held, and then nothing would materialize. What finally broke the stalemate was modest by comparison. A minor league baseball stadium opened in 2001 on the old Steeplechase site and brought something Coney Island had been missing for decades, a reliable reason for ordinary New Yorkers to come back. The Brooklyn Cyclones gave the area a small but consistent pulse. The 2009 rezoning was the city's most ambitious attempt at a comprehensive revival plan. It created a 9.4-acre protected amusement district and approved construction of roughly 4,500 housing units, including 900 affordable units. Luna Park, a new one, unrelated to the original, opened in 2010 on part of the old Astroland site. New roller coasters followed. The Thunderbolt, a steel coaster named after the beloved wooden original, opened in 2014. A live performance venue, the Ford Amphitheater, opened on the boardwalk in 2016. The B&B Carousel, a historic carousel that had been in storage for years, was restored and reopened at Luna Park in 2013. These were real improvements, not transformational, not a return to anything resembling the old Coney Island, but tangible signs that the city was at least trying to keep the amusement area alive rather than pave it over entirely. And then Hurricane Sandy hit in October 2012 and reminded everyone that Coney Island is, at the end of the day, a sandbar. The amusement parks, the aquarium, and businesses throughout the neighborhood sustained major damage. Remarkably, the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest, which has happened every July 4th on Surf Avenue since 1972 as a modern competition, went ahead the following summer as scheduled. Some things, apparently, are non-negotiable. The neighborhood is among the most flood-vulnerable in New York City, a fact that takes on a different weight when you realize that hundreds of new residential towers have been going up there throughout the 2000s and 2000s on a peninsula that sea level projections suggest will face increasingly serious flooding. By 2023, half a dozen apartment buildings had been or were being built along Surf Avenue. In February 2025, the city announced plans for the Coney Island West project, which would add another 1,500 housing units on the peninsula's western end. Whether building thousands of new homes on a flood-prone barrier island is an act of urban renewal or an act of denial is a question nobody in city government seems particularly eager to answer out loud. As of 2026, Coney Island is in a strange middle state. Luna Park operates seasonally. The Cyclone still runs. Nathan's Famous is still there on the corner of Surf and Stillwell, where it has been since 1916. The Wonder Wheel turns. The boardwalk is there, somewhat reconstructed after Sandy. There are concerts and the annual Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest and the Mermaid Parade. On a warm summer Saturday, it's easy to feel like the place has a heartbeat again. But the neighborhood's poverty rate remains above 27%. The high-rise housing projects are still there. The storefronts that once lined the surrounding streets never came back to anything like their former density. And the three original parks, Steeplechase, Luna, Dreamland, exist now only in photographs, postcards, and the memories of people old enough to have been there. Part 2. What was actually lost? It's worth stepping back from the timeline and the real estate deals for a moment to think about what Coney Island actually represented and what its decline actually cost. In the early 20th century, Coney Island was one of the few places in New York, in America, where class barriers genuinely dissolved, at least for an afternoon. The immigrant who'd arrived at Ellis Island a month earlier and the family that had been in Brooklyn for 3 generations shared the same beach. That wasn't incidental to what Coney Island was. It was the whole point. The subway made it possible. 5 cents, and you were out of the tenement and on a beach with a million other people, with cotton candy and salt air and the sound of a roller coaster going by overhead. That version of democratic public pleasure is almost impossible to reconstruct. It's also worth remembering what the surrounding residential neighborhood had been before urban renewal dismantled it. The west end of Coney Island, which Moses declared a slum in 1949, was a functioning community. There were over 400 storefronts on Mermaid Avenue alone. Immigrant families, Italian, Jewish, later others, had built lives there, running businesses out of the street-level floors of 3-story brick buildings, renting the upper floors. It wasn't wealthy, but it worked. The city's own slum clearance program was later exposed by investigators as benefiting developers far more than it helped the families who were displaced. Many of those families were relocated to the very bungalow colonies of the West End that were in the worst condition, having been redlined by banks and starved of investment since the 1940s, when Robert Moses decided that Coney Island's amusement culture was too low class, too noisy, too disorderly for his vision of a properly run city. He wasn't just making a planning decision. He was deciding who the city was for and who it wasn't for. The people who had depended on Coney Island as one of their few accessible luxuries. The ones who couldn't afford the Catskills or the Jersey Shore or a car to drive to Jones Beach. Those were the people who paid the steepest price for what he did. And when Fred Trump threw that demolition party in 1966, and invited people to break windows in the building that Till Yu had spent his life building, it wasn't just a piece of architecture being destroyed. It was a very public statement about what the neighborhood's future was going to look like, and who was going to profit from it. These things are easy to look back on with a certain condescension, or even to critique on legitimate grounds. But they were also part of an irreplaceable American vernacular culture. Coney Island, USA, opened its sideshows by the seashore in 1985, and it's reportedly the only traditional 10-in-1 sideshow still operating in North America. One out of everything that once existed. The writer Henry Miller, who grew up in Brooklyn, once described Coney Island in terms that might sound like pure nostalgia, but hold up as description. It was a place where you could lose yourself in the crowd and feel, paradoxically, less alone. That's a hard thing to manufacture. It's an even harder thing to get back once it's gone. Part 1. What remains? There are things still worth seeing at Coney Island, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The Cyclone is a legitimate piece of American history. Built in 1927, landmarked in 1988, it's still running and still terrifying in the best possible way. The Wonder Wheel, built in 1920, is still turning. The boardwalk is there, Nathan's is there, the aquarium is there. Luna Park, whatever you think of it, as a successor to the original, operates and draws visitors. The Brooklyn Cyclones play baseball from spring through summer, and there are worse ways to spend a warm evening in New York. The Coney Island History Project maintains an exhibition center and archive that is genuinely worth visiting if you want to understand what the place was. It's located near the entrance to Dino's Wonder Wheel Park, and the kind of material that keeps the record straight. The parachute jump still stands on the boardwalk. 262 feet of steel and history lit up at night, not operating, but not gone either. There's something fitting about the fact that Fred Trump tried to demolish it and couldn't afford to. Sometimes the things that survive are the ones that were just too stubborn or too expensive to kill. What's gone, though, is gone for real. The Pavilion of Fun, Dreamland, the original Luna Park, the old residential West End with its brick apartment buildings and street-level stores, none of it is coming back. The photographs exist. The oral histories exist. But the thing itself, the lived experience of a summer Saturday in Coney Island at its peak, that's irretrievable. Coney Island has been declared dead and revived and declared dead again so many times that the pattern itself has become part of the story. Every generation seems to find a version of it to mourn and a version of it to defend. What makes the decline genuinely worth examining isn't the nostalgia. It's the specific combination of forces that brought it about. Bad policy decisions made by people who held enormous power and were never accountable to the communities they affected. Real estate interests that saw land value where a neighborhood existed. Urban crisis that was in part manufactured and in part the result of national economic shifts that no single city could have controlled. And underneath all of it, the slow erosion of something that had been, for a few decades in the early 20th century, one of the most genuinely democratic public spaces in the country. That's worth remembering, not just for Coney Island's sake, but because the same forces have played out in city after city, neighborhood after neighborhood, and continue to play out today. If this video gave you something to think about, consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more deep dives into the places and stories that shaped American history, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.